Thank you, guys. Thanks for being here. Good morning, all. My name is Lamont. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection. Thanks for joining us. We're here to discuss Senate Bill 888, which is an act responsibly and equitably regulating adult use cannabis. I think that we all know this is the governor's bill to allow for to end the prohibition on the sale of cannabis for adults in the recreational market. I think we all know that, and the majority of the state agrees, whether or not you think this is personally beneficial, that the way in which we have gone about as a nation, as a state, as a society, criminalizing the use of cannabis historically has not protected public health and safety in the best way, and has caused disproportionate impacts to specific communities of color here in Connecticut and across the nation. And so this act of the historic injustices caused by the war on drugs accepts the reality of the public health and safety of our folks across the state of Connecticut, and seeks to end the prohibition on adult use cannabis and do so responsibly and thoughtfully in a way going forward that redresses prior wrongs and also creates an effect in the state, for consumers in the state, for communities that have been hurt historically by this. And to do that, I think we've got to think about the kind of market we are setting up for cannabis going forward. We've got to consider those who still have convictions resulting from cannabis prohibition in the past, and how we can ensure that those prior convictions don't hold them back going forward. Municipalities and the major municipalities across Connecticut and towns, large and small. We've got to look at how we continue to ensure public health and safety for communities, for consumers across Connecticut. And finally, we've got to look at social equity and the way in which we redress the wrongs.
I think Arunan's taking a short break. You there, Arunan?
Yeah, Mike, you can Representative D'Agostino.
I'm happy to pick up right there, actually.
Thank you. You got it, man.
I'm the House Chair of the General Law Committee, which is tasked with overseeing our current medical marijuana program, and will also be involved in the regulation of the adult use marketplace. I want to thank the governor and his staff for inviting me today. I'm going to just talk briefly about the act that Arunan was introducing very quickly. And look, this is a comprehensive bill, but it has three main and very logical components: decriminalization, regulation, and revenue generation. And I'm going to touch on all three briefly, but it's important to keep in mind, as Arunan was mentioning, that one animating principle and theme that's embedded throughout all of those components is equity, and I'll explain why in a second. The first component I mentioned of this bill is decriminalization. You can't have an adult use market, obviously, without first making it legal to possess. The bill builds upon the work that Connecticut did 5 years ago to make an infraction of possession of less than half an ounce, and now makes it legal to possess up to 1.5 ounces in the adult use market, more if you're a medical patient. But even beyond the 1.5, it's important to note that in this act, we reduce penalties on a gradated level above the 1.5. So it's not like you're going to wind up in jail if you've got 2 ounces or 2.5. There are fines. There are those are misdemeanors still, because obviously we need to regulate the black market. But there's an entire decriminalization element to that. To this bill that begins with, of course, possession. Important from the equity standpoint, of course, with decriminalization is expungement of records and expungement of convictions. The bill creates a mechanism for doing that either automatic or in some cases upon petition, depending upon the date of the conviction, and I can explain why later, but I won't get into it now. The important thing to mention, of course, for current purposes, is that from an equity standpoint, we recognize, and the governor recognizes, that expungement of those records is key and part of decriminalization. The second component, regulation, I realize probably doesn't get as much attention. It's not sexy to talk about regulations, but it's probably the most comprehensive and in-depth part of this act because it controls everything: who can sell, what they can sell, where they can sell. And this is where there's really an equity component built into this act. And I want to emphasize this because it's very unique and creative what the governor's proposed here. He's expanding the marketplace for new entrants. So you do not need hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars of capital to get into this marketplace. If you want to create a certain product, a cannabis-based beverage, a certain brownie, go ahead and do that. You want to create a delivery company, go ahead and do that. You, instead of needing 40,000 square feet and millions of dollars to do a large grow facility, if you want to focus on growing a particular strand of cannabis and do that and market that, you can do that. So these reduced barriers to entry are a significant equity component of this bill, giving people the opportunity on the front end to get into this marketplace. That's critical. That's unique. That's something, as far as I'm aware, other states are not doing, and it's in this bill. And then the third component, revenue generation, an obvious piece of that. We anticipate revenues in fiscal year 23 of $33 million, and it builds from there. The entire marketplace, of course, builds on the very successful medical cannabis marketplace that we have. We preserve that as well. While we do tax on an excise level and a sales tax level the adult use marketplace, the medical marketplace remains tax-free on the retail level. That's very important. We're setting parameters for this so we can decimate the black market, but also generate revenue for the state of Connecticut. And then, of course, overseeing all three components in this bill is an equity commission. And that will help make recommendations and oversee both how we allow people who have been impacted by the failed war on drugs and failed war on cannabis, on giving them opportunities to enter the marketplace on the front end, and then make recommendations. And I know this is on a lot of people's minds on where that money will go on the back end, where that revenue generation will go on the back end. That equity commission will have rules for everybody in this and make recommendations that we can move forward with over the years. This is not a one-time thing. We get this done, and then we proceed with that equity theme, again, as I mentioned, animating the entire purpose of this bill. As the governor has said, the prohibition on adult use cannabis has failed. This bill will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry that my internet issues at home here. I'm signing on from my phone. I'm going to move the discussion over to DCP Commissioner Michelle Siegel, who's going to talk about what regulation might look like under this bill and how it has worked previously in the medical marijuana space.
I will unmute myself now. Good morning, everyone. We're really honored to be a part of this roundtable. This is such an important bill, and it's going to do great things for Connecticut. As was explained, we have probably the least glamorous part of today's conversation. We'll talk a bit about how the marketplace will be regulated based on sort of the lessons learned from the medical marijuana program. So medical marijuana became legal in Connecticut in 2012, with the Department of Consumer Protection being the primary regulatory agency. And so we've learned a lot in the years since then in terms of how to best protect patients or consumers, and also how to protect surrounding communities. And this is really going to inform the work we're going to do with an adult use cannabis marketplace. There's sort of four key areas that we're looking at. I mean, there's a number of others too, but four really worth highlighting. First is product safety, and that's really important. whether it's an edible or something that somebody may smoke, it's really important that the product be safe for people to use. So in that regard, we're going to be licensing all the businesses, make sure they have appropriate procedures, standards in place for growing, manufacturing, handling this. We'll be doing site inspections before final license approval. Products, just as they are in the medical market, will be lab tested. We want to protect against adulteration or just other contaminants, whether it's heavy metals or pesticides. And then there'll be limits on what serving size and potency can be, so people don't inadvertently take more than they're realizing. A second important thing is preventing diversion. So there will be security requirements for all of our businesses. There's going to be a seed to sale tracking system so we can really monitor the flow of the product through the supply chain as it works its way to the ultimate consumer. And then employees will be registered or licensed, so we have a handle on who is lawfully handling what may be large amounts of product. Protecting against sales to underage users or even marketing to underage users is really important. So retailers, of course, would need to check ID just as they do for sales of other products that are age restricted. There's going to be child resistant packaging, so particularly young children don't inadvertently see a product that looks appealing and get into it. And then advertising limits. The product can't be advertised in media or at events where more than 10% of the people will be underage. Similarly, can't use characters, pictures, other types of images that would appeal to people under 21. And then a final really important step is that we want to preserve the medical market. It has been a very successful program. It's helping about 50,000 patients right now, and we don't want them to be lost in this. So before any of the medical businesses can convert over and begin selling to adult users, they're going to need to provide us with a conversion plan that explains to us in detail how they're going to protect their medical patients, make sure those patients still have the medicine they need, are not dealing with huge lines, et cetera. So with that, I will hand it back to my able deputy to hand it off to the next speaker.
Sure. Commissioner, so as we think about how we, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure when exactly I cut off in my initial introduction there, but as we think about allowing for adult use cannabis in a recreational market, there are still people who live in our state today who face the obstacles of having a criminal conviction from cannabis use or sale or possession, and it would be inhumane to allow for adult use cannabis sales and possession and use to occur in our state without dealing with the obstacles that exist for people who in the past have experienced criminalization because of that. And so we're going to hear from Mike Lawler, who you all know. Mike has been involved in the criminal justice space for decades, both as a state rep, as the undersecretary for policy and planning around criminal justice issues in the Malloy administration at OPM, and now as an associate professor. He's got a wealth of knowledge, and we're fortunate to hear from him. So I'll turn it over to Mike.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Good morning, Governor. Thank you very much for asking me to participate in this discussion. You know, this is really important, and I've been asked to focus on the criminal justice side of this particular legislation. And let me begin by saying this. You know, it is the case that there just aren't that many people incarcerated right now just because of a possession of marijuana, but there's lots of people who have historically been arrested, charged, and convicted for this stuff, even including recently. Last year in our state, more than 7,500 people were arrested and charged with some form of possession of marijuana. And to put that in perspective, the total number of criminal arrests in the whole state was 70,000. So that's about a number equal to about 10% of the business of our criminal courts. And it's important to keep in mind, if you take that out of the flow of business in our criminal courts, you allow prosecutors and judges and police to focus on the higher risk violent offenders. And that by itself is a good thing. Beyond that, as was just explained, you know, you're giving a pathway to erasure of records for people who perhaps a year ago, perhaps a decade or two ago, have been arrested or convicted of one of these marijuana possession related crimes. And as I think we all know, the collateral consequences of that type of history are significant. It makes it difficult to get a job or to rent an apartment or get into a college or even get into a relationship sometimes, because with the advent of the internet, people can search this stuff and find it out. And it really creates a lot of collateral damage for people who may have their only misconduct in their history was getting caught with some marijuana. So this is a big deal. The other thing about this legislation, which I think people really need to keep in mind, is that this is like the worst nightmare for organized crime drug dealers, because all of this historically has existed in the black market, and as it transitions into some lawful regulated market, this really is going to put a big dent in the business of people who are engaged in organized crime. And among other things, of course, they don't pay taxes. And so this is an important way to rein in the kinds of criminal behavior we see generally in the state, because we're going to take at least a big part of their business away. The other thing I want to point out here, and this I think is extremely significant to keep in mind, broader perspective beyond just criminal justice. This process nationwide of reconsidering criminal penalties for marijuana possession and marijuana sales has been going on for more than a decade. And I think the earlier attempts were, well-intentioned, but had a lot of unintended consequences, like, for example, in Colorado and California. But over time, states have learned from trial and error how to do this right. And I think Connecticut, starting with medical marijuana, and now with Governor Lamont's proposal for marijuana generally, recreational use and possession, I think the legislation you see here is about as tightly written as I've ever seen. Right now, New Jersey has just, the governor in New Jersey has just signed a law legalizing possession of marijuana for adults. Virginia, both houses of their legislature have approved it. It's working its way to the governor's desk. And these 2021 enactments really grow upon lessons learned from elsewhere. And so that's why I'm very confident that the concerns that people have, for example, related to driving while under the influence of marijuana, I mean, you see a provision in this bill to provide explicit training to police to how to recognize the signs of intoxication as they relate to marijuana. And frequently you see this combination of alcohol and marijuana in drivers. And I think we will be best positioned to focus on that as a real problem, because it is, of course, a real problem. It's been a real problem, even though it's been illegal. But now our police officers, our frontline police officers, will have the ability to deal with that. The final thing I want to mention, and this goes to equity, this goes to the racially disparate impact of the unintended consequences of some of our drug policies. Without going into a whole law school class lecture, it is worth noting that police are allowed to search a vehicle without a search warrant if they have probable cause to believe there's evidence of a crime in that vehicle. And in our state and elsewhere, especially in New York City, recent data has indicated that police officers saying that they smelled marijuana when they stopped a car for a routine motor vehicle stop have led to a search of those vehicles. And now we know in many of these cases, when that was the justification for the search, marijuana was not discovered in the car. So it's possible that some police officers are just saying that because it's impossible to disprove that they claim they smelled it. And that has had a disparate effect on people of color. There's no question about that. Our own Connecticut data show this, that in the 10 or 12 communities where we've done a deep dive statistically into the reason for searches of motor vehicles, when the reason has been the detection of the odor of marijuana has been the justification for the search, and the search takes place and evidence of marijuana is found, there's an extraordinary disparity when it comes to people of color being searched based for that reason. And just to be clear, the reason for the search was the officer claimed they smelled marijuana, but when they did the search, no marijuana was found in the car. And I think that, among other things, is a reason to very strongly consider this bill. And I'm very happy to see my state, Connecticut, leading the charge in doing what I think will be the best in the nation version of this equity and drug policy reform legislation.
Thank you for that. And I think that segues well into our next portion of the conversation, which is around social equity. And there's been a lot of conversation, obviously, in the legislature, in the press, and in the governor's office about social equity and what that looks like. And at a base level, I think we can all understand where this conversation started. That there are communities or people who have been impacted, as Mike said, for generations, who have had layers of impact on their lives and their livelihoods and their jobs and their families, and because of a prohibition on doing the exact sort of activity that this bill proposes to allow a small number of people to make a lot of money off of. And the governor's bill seeks to redress the impact of that and the historic wrong of that by dealing directly with social equity in those communities. To do this, and I don't know of any other state in the nation that has tried this, but to start off the discussion of social equity, the governor put together a task force of community leaders and members, not policy people specifically, not politicians, but folks who are in the communities, who are talking to people day to day who have been impacted by this, to come up with the solutions around social equity. The people who are closest to the pain have been part of crafting what this social equity plan looks like. And what we heard in conversations with regulators in other states, and in talking to folks in these communities, is that this social equity plan needs to be broad-based and focus not merely on who gets these businesses and these licenses at the end of the day, but what our community impact is on the end of the day. Because as Mike laid out very eloquently, the impacts that have been felt across communities are layered and complex and just so broad-based that the response needs to be equally broad-based. And the governor's bill is really the only one in the legislature that seeks to address social equity in as broad of a manner as this group of stakeholders and community members said was important. So we're going to hear from a very active and involved member of that group, Reverend Tommy Jackson, who has been involved in community activity in his town in Sanford for a while and across the country, and can speak to the social equity plan in this bill and what that looks like practically. So Reverend Jackson, I'll let you take over.
Reverend, I think you're on
You're
mute.
muted.
How about, can you hear me now? Okay, good morning again. Good morning to you, Governor. Good morning.
Reverend, I think you muted yourself again.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Runan. I'll stop with the introductions to the pray that everyone has heard me, but thank you for sharing. And I want to thank the governor and Jonathan Harris for inviting me to share in the Commission on Equity Discussion Group, Cannabis Equity Discussion Group that Runan was a part of. My concern with regard to social equity is, and I'll give you what I call my definition for social equity. It is an active commitment to fairness, to justice and equality in the formulation of public policy. It is concerned with the distribution of public services, the implementation of a public policy, and management of any and all agencies with direct service to the public. So that when we begin to talk about equity in this situation that the governor is proposing this bill, it is a worthy goal for many reasons. It's a worthy goal for its moral implications that are directly related to or linked with fairness and social justice. You've heard the concern and statement made by Commissioner Lawler relative to matters related to decriminalization and what happens with people going in and out of prison. We started off with our state delegate, our state representative, giving the 3 points on decriminalization, regulation, and revenue enhancement. And when we talk about the Equity Commission, all of those things are important. And they're important because through an Equity Commission, you have policies that are promoted that do help and directly and indirectly reduce poverty. And the communities that are going to be impacted by the Equity Commission will receive greater resources to enhance the community, greater resources to support their schools. Tax revenues will come in ways that had not been anticipated. This more than $300 million will certainly benefit communities, not only like Stanford, but like New Haven, like Waterbury, like Hartford, that deserve this kind of attention. Some years ago, I had the opportunity to share and work with a similar program in Maryland, and they came up with a disparate study relative to the equity group, made several recommendations relative to how these things could do. And what I gleaned from the study and what I carry with today, even in sharing in the cannabis equity discussion group, is that equity policies promote and or enhance social cohesion as well as minimize political conflict. For an example, the war on drugs that we had in the 1980s during the Reagan administration that even continued into the Clinton years as president, we've seen today as a result of the 2020 presidential election, people coming out and saying, we need to come together to address these things and to address these concerns. And across the state legislature here in Connecticut, we're seeing, without regard to party identification, people saying this bill, Senate Bill 888, that has been introduced and being sponsored and being pushed by Governor Lamont, it is critical, it is necessary, it is imperative, it is important. I've seen young people as well as older people in the congregations that I've served here in Connecticut and in Delaware and in my home state of Maryland, where people were desperately impacted because of having an ounce of what we call in college an OZ of marijuana, or a nickel bag, if you will, or a $10 bag, and resulted in getting a criminal conviction, which even to this day has haunted many of these people in their professional lives and their ability to go into the world of commerce and to engage in an appropriate way. When we look at this equity that's being introduced for the Equitable Commission, the expansion of the marketplace, which was said earlier, the commerce that's going to come back into the community, it's going to enhance many policies and programs and services that need to get done, not just from a social justice perspective, but from a law enforcement perspective, from education, and many other ways that the community will benefit. So I am definitely in support of, I encourage, worked last year trying to get this through the General Assembly prior to the cannabis, prior to the pandemic, I'm sorry. And so now I still remain, and I remain even more than last year with the Senate bill, this bill, encouraged to hope that we get this through the General Assembly, and that when we have all of these things done, year 23, we will all clap our hands and say, hallelujah, thank you, Ned Lamont, for being the catalyst to get this done.
Thank you, Reverend Jackson. Thank you for all of your contributions to this bill. There's been a lot of questions around how this might impact municipalities. And to help us better understand that, we're going to hear from Ben Florsheim, who's the mayor of Middletown. He is a thoughtful and considerate public servant, and look forward to hearing from you. So, Mayor Florsheim, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Arun, and thank you, Governor, for the opportunity to be with you on this really important topic that I think represents a huge opportunity for municipalities and cities like Middletown. And I'm glad that we've got so many different perspectives having this conversation right now, because there are so many variables, so many factors that need to be considered. But from where I sit, what I can tell you is that a small city like Middletown in the center of the state, with both a vibrant downtown and a vibrant industrial sector and everything in between, that there are a lot of opportunities, I think, for the legal commercial sale of marijuana here done in the right way. And I can also tell you that there are at least half a dozen, if not more, recreational dispensaries that are in southern and western Massachusetts that are less than an hour's drive for residents in Middletown. I can tell you also for a fact that there are people in Middletown who are making that drive, and not just Middletown, but cities all around central Connecticut. And the revenues, obviously these are places that are taking in money hand over fist from eager customers. And in addition to the revenue on the state side that gets talked about a lot, there is also a revenue opportunity here for cities and towns, and the bills, the tax bills that are most burdensome and most onerous on Connecticut residents are those local property tax bills for the most part. And part of that is because our only tool at the local level for raising revenue is property taxes, which winds up getting disproportionately placed on people who are least able to pay. That's why economic development is such an important tool at the local level, is growing our tax base and bringing in more businesses and more revenue. We know there's a lot of revenue to be had in this business. We are also excited about the prospect of the sales tax, the excise tax being shared with municipalities that will allow us to invest in local programs to make sure, for instance, that our police are properly trained, certainly in the things that Mike Lawler was talking about, but also in things like directing traffic and staffing the facilities that are going to open up, because we know that is something that has been encountered in other places. This demand is high. I was talking to a reporter about this the other day, and that's my first concern as I think about it from a municipal standpoint. If we opened up a dispensary in Middletown, my first question would be, just like at our vaccine clinics, we're gonna have a lot of people lining up, and we need to make sure that we're prepared to manage traffic. So those are the types of things that we have to think about at the local level, and those are the types of things that I think the financial support from the sales tax revenue, not just at the state level, but that will be shared at the local level, can be really beneficial towards. I also think, and Representative D'Agostino was talking about this. I think that this is really important, that the final bill and that this legislation focus on empowering the smaller producers and growers and providers and sellers. Small businesses are the backbone of our economy here in Middletown and all around Connecticut. And I think that one of the important, I said a moment ago, there's a lot of money to be made in this industry, and people are ready to make a lot of money. And there's big business that is seeing this as a cash cow opportunity for them. And I think we need to be cautious about that. And in addition to, learning from the opportunity, or learning from the mistakes and challenges that have happened in other states that have legalized and decriminalized before Connecticut, we also have to learn from the successes and the failures and the public policy problems that have been created by other industries in this sort of general field. And I'm talking about the tobacco industry, I'm talking about the alcohol industry, and most recently, I'm talking about the prescription drug industry. And I think that the lesson from all those industries is that the only people who are more dangerous and irresponsible at the intersection of drugs and lots of money than black market drug dealers are big corporations. And we have to be cognizant of that going forward. And I think that empowering the small producers, the small businesses who are going to see opportunity here as well, particularly those who have, as Reverend Jackson was talking about, have been coming out of incarceration or having a criminal record related to marijuana. We have to make sure that is at the center of the conversation, I think. That's what I hear in Middletown locally, and that's the type of business model that we want to continue to support here in Middletown. I think the benefit of the good thing about marijuana versus cigarettes and alcohol and OxyContin is that it can't kill you, but we also have to make sure that it would not be a good bill. It would not be a good proposal, and it wouldn't be a good law if there weren't provisions to make sure that we don't repeat the same mistakes that were made in those industries. And I think that there's a lot of promising language in here that I'm looking forward to working with the state and our other municipalities on. And then the last thing that I will say, the Speaker of the House, Matt Ritter, was at our Middlesex Chamber meeting a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked him about marijuana legalization and the prospect for that in this session. And he said something that I thought was very insightful, which is that the passage or the fact that we haven't passed legalization in Connecticut up until this session is because it's been no one's number one priority. No individual has been out front on it. It's been a lot of people's sort of third, fourth, or fifth priority maybe, but it's something that needs a champion. And it's something that there needs to be consensus around a single. And he said, I think he said something along the lines of, I can whip votes for one bill, but I can't whip votes for 12 bills at the same time. And so I think that it is really, really promising that we are here having this discussion now with all of these different stakeholders, because I know that there are criticisms, I know that there are concerns, I know that, around issues like equity, like we're talking about today, around things like home grow, around other questions. There are different proposals out there, and I think that it is so important that we strike while the iron is hot in this legislative session. We get everybody to the table and iron out those differences so we can focus on one proposal and get it across the finish line, because we know that this is a pressing issue for revenue reasons, for public health reasons, and I'm really glad to see that that is exactly the approach that's be underway here. We're getting the issues resolved. And I'm looking forward to being helpful however we can, because we think that this can be done the right way, a really beneficial thing for our city. And I know that the same is true for other cities across the state.
Thank you, Mayor Florsheim. We appreciate that. And, finally, we're going to hear, before we hear from Governor Lamont, from a member of our manufacturing sector. The governor's office obviously understands the importance of our manufacturing sector to our economy here in Connecticut. And as this bill was crafted, we reached out to and tried to understand and get input from our manufacturing sector. So Charles Daniels, who is the CFO of Webco Plastics, is going to speak to the impact on manufacturing of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me today. I believe that this bill is a long time coming. I'm surprised it's something that we haven't been able to do earlier. And I do understand that there's a lot of concerns in the business community, specifically in manufacturing, but I don't think a lot of those are based in reality. As many people have said here today, it's marijuana is something that is fairly easily accessible. I believe the other day I was driving and I saw a billboard even that said, 20 miles to the closest legal marijuana store. So I think it's something that we need to do, and I don't see a lot of risk in it as a business owner and someone that helps to run a business, a manufacturing company in Connecticut. I think there's a lot of protection in here, not just for our owner, but also for our team, for the people that work for us. And I think that that's really important in a comprehensive bill. And as late adopters to this, I'm confident that with the best practices that we've seen with other states, that we're really well positioned right now to do this. I've been able to review the proposal, and I think that it checks a lot of boxes. We've talked a lot here about tax revenue, but I think I see a lot of opportunity there for cost reduction. And when you see something new in business that has the potential to raise revenues and reduce costs, and it's potentially low risk across a lot of different areas, it seems like a no-brainer. So. And somebody that works in product development at Webco Plastics, one of the most exciting things I think is the opportunity for entrepreneurship for people that have been working in this trade one way or another over the course of the last several years, now have an opportunity to come out and do so legally. And I see the opportunity for a lot of innovation in a lot of different ways. Listening to Representative D'Agostino talk about all of the different things, it really sparked my creative side, and I think that there's really a lot of potential there. So thank you, Governor Lamont, for spearheading this and for getting it out, and I definitely look forward to being a champion of this in the manufacturing sector among my colleagues, and I'm happy to help any way that I can going forward. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. So I thank you to all of our panelists. I think, as you can see, clearly the state, regardless of their personal views on cannabis, believe that the time for prohibition of cannabis, the criminalization of use of cannabis has passed, and the time's come for a new reality, but to do so thoughtfully, to do so that in a way that considers the market that we are creating, that considers the ongoing public health and safety of our communities, of consumers, that considers the impacts both to those who have been convicted of criminal possession or sale of cannabis, and to the communities that have been impacted from the historic war on drugs, to do so in a way that considers the impact to our business communities, to our municipalities, requires setting a broad table with a lot of folks and stakeholders at the table. And I want to applaud the governor for doing so in crafting this bill and for kicking off this conversation. And so I will hand it over to the governor. Thank you for having us here today, and thank you for considering this input and for opening this conversation and continuing this conversation. So, Governor Lamont, I will hand it off to you.
Hey, thanks, Arun, and thank you, everybody. I think you made the arguments really well. And Charles Daniels, you're right. This has been a long time coming. We've been talking about this for ages. And I think now is the time for legalize adult use recreational marijuana in a carefully regulated way with an emphasis upon equity and justice. Now is the time. You know, there are a number of reasons why, one of which is prohibition doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, I know you think I'm really old. You think that Tommy Jackson and I were out there having bathtub gin during the speakeasies back in the roaring 20s with Ben Florsheim's great-grandfather, but it didn't work back then. And it created a lot of alcohol poisoning. It wasn't called the roaring 20s because everybody gave up alcohol. And Al Capone and the underground market took over for a period of time, and they learned and they stopped. And alcohol was a carefully regulated market. And now is the time to make that change as well. And I think you've made the case very well. I mean, Michelle, you and Arunan have emphasized public health. And we're going to do this in a way that makes sure that the underground market does not have a lot of highly potent illegal substances, fentanyl, all the ways the underground market can make this a much more dangerous market. That if you go out and buy it from an underground dealer, what that risk could be. And I think you've thought about this in a very thoughtful way. And we've learned from lessons from our other states. You know, as Mike said, you know, Colorado's been doing this for a decade. Even South Dakota just approved it. New Jersey is just signed it yesterday. New York and Massachusetts. So we're not an island unto ourselves. We're going to learn from their lessons and do this in a thoughtful way. And secondly, when you have a law that's so widely abused, sometimes the enforcement is incredibly erratic as well, and erratic with prejudice. And, you know, Mike, I thought that was fascinating what you said. I mean, I know our jails are not necessarily loaded with people with low-level marijuana convictions, but you point out 7,500 people have been convicted. 7,500 people have been arrested. That can stick on your record. That can impact the person's life for an awful long time. That's the wrong thing to do, and let's be blunt about it. You know, my kid is probably a lot less likely to get arrested than a black kid if they have a half an ounce of pot in the seat next to them, and that's just fundamentally unfair. So I'm proud of what we've done in terms of justice and in terms of erasure of those convictions and giving people a second chance, since that's what we're about. And, you know, Mike D'Agostino, you know, you and Charles, I think you described, we're going to give people an opportunity here as well. I mean, a lot of states, they have a $10 million entrance fee, licensing fee to get into this, but we're not doing that. I think it's going to be done to some degree by lottery, as well as the medical marijuana, giving small businesses an entrepreneurial opportunity to get into a related business, not necessarily just legalize marijuana. What that means in terms of helping businesses grow, especially in those distressed communities that have been hardest hit by the war on drugs. And, you know, Ben, you said it well. We're going to use the revenues from this to get back into the community, get back to municipalities, hold down property taxes, and help some of the communities that have been hardest hit get back on their feet. And I think that's an important piece of the equity justice that we mean to do. We've been working on this a long time. I need you all to stand up, you know, as champions on this, as, you know, you said what Matt Ritter had said. I think doing this in association with all of our regional governors, we're not an island unto ourselves. We can do this in a safe, regular way that it adjusts some of the wrongs of the past and gives folks who have been hardest hit an opportunity to get back on their feet. that's why I'm a strong supporter of this, and I'm glad you are too.
Thank you, Governor. And thank you for bringing us together to have this conversation. So with that, we will open it up to members of the press. And Rob, I don't know if you are going to.
Yep, I'll take it from here.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. We'll start with Hearst, Connecticut Media.
Wait, I missed the whole thing.
Hi, whoop. Hey, it's Ken. Yeah, I got a few questions. Like, Arun, how is Massachusetts doing with their equity portion? They've had a few years going. Have you had a chance to study them?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. We did, and actually with our Equity Commission, we spoke to one of the commissioners of their Cannabis Control Commission, I think it's called, and we'd asked them how they'd been going. And at the time we spoke to them, that was in December, I think, they had a total of 9 equity applicants. And Massachusetts, just for some context, their equity program focuses entirely on licensing. And so creating cannabis businesses, giving them sort of an initial foot in the door in thoughts that a more diverse marketplace, that the effects of that will trickle down to the communities. They have a total of 9 applicants that have gotten up and running when we spoke to them in December. And their definition for social equity is a little broad. It includes veterans and women, regardless of ethnic background, racial background. So only a small portion of that 9 were Black and Brown owned businesses. But I think it speaks to, with all respect to Massachusetts, and they were early out the door and tried a program. But one of the things they told us, one of the things California told us was, other programs have set the floor, and we should try to aim a little higher. It speaks to why sort of the focus on licensing can become so narrow and not see that the community can fail to see some of the benefits of an equity program that a more broad-based structure can create.
Thanks. And Professor Lawler, those the 7,500 arrests, are they necessarily racially disparate? Or is it mostly cities where the arrests are occurring?
Thanks, Ken. You can call me Mike. So those numbers I got from Judicial last night. Fortunately, they're very very capable of generating numbers very quickly. Those are statewide numbers. Most of them are under the infraction, right? So possession of less than a half an ounce of marijuana is an infraction, not a crime. But it just gives you a sense of, the 6,633 arrests last year in 2020 for this, for marijuana possession, compared to about 70,000 total statewide arrests for all crimes, kind of gives you some sense of proportion. Where those arrests are taking place, I don't have that data. It's possible to get it. My guess is, like everything else in criminal justice world, there's a disparate number of people of color and a disparate number of city-based arrests, only because that's where the concentration of the police happens to take place. But anyway, hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. I've got 2 more questions too. Quickly, Mayor Florsheim, have you gamed out what kind of revenue that the Middletown might make on being the home of whatever kind of distribution or growing, or however the legislation's written?
I haven't. It's a good question. I think that's something that would be helpful to have comparisons from some of some comparable towns in Massachusetts, and to try to tweak it based on this bill. But that's something that I'll have to crunch the numbers on. But I don't have that for you at the moment.
Okay, thanks. And finally, Representative D'Agostino, we've certainly talked about this a few times over the last few months. How is the count looking? And why should I look at this with anything other than a jaundiced eye when you're talking about the need for imagination and people stepping up to a controversial bill in the legislature?
I think that the difference this year, obviously, is it's got the force and weight of the governor's office behind it. That's something we've never had before, and it lends a certain focus to this effort. And also, quite frankly, I think what's different this year, in addition to that, is what we're seeing in our neighboring states. There's now, I think, a little bit more of an urgency that everybody's starting to realize we have to do something, and if we don't, we're just going to be impossibly left behind. So that's I think what's different this year. Although I appreciate you lend that jaundiced eye to just about everything that goes through the legislature, Kevin.
It's training and experience.
Yeah, sure.
And finally, that the governor ran for election on 2018 and for legalized adult use, and it's taking this long to get it even closer. But okay, thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Ken. Moving on to the Hartford Current.
Thank you very much. This is Steve Singer at the Hartford Current. My question is for either Governor Lamont or Representative D'Agostino. Some of the larger defense manufacturers have come out against the bill. They're under federal regulations that prohibit controlled substances in the workplace, and there are other federal rules. We have obviously a really significant supply chains here for Pratt & Whitney, Collins Aerospace, Sikorsky, and Electric Boat. And Mr. Graney of Electric Boat just a few weeks ago repeated his opposition to the bill. And I'm wondering if the governor or others who are backing this bill have concerns to those manufacturers.
Want to start, Mike?
Thank you, Governor. Yeah, in fact, I guess I disagree with the characterization. I don't know if they came out against the bill. They certainly expressed their concern as federal contractors. And this bill does include provisions where our legalization of it does not override, obviously cannot override what they need to comply with as defense contractors or other provisions of federal law. I know Michelle might be able to touch into our wheelhouse from the regulatory environment. So the short answer is we've heard those concerns. We've addressed that. We're obviously very much aware of the fact that we've got a critical defense industry here, and there's certain things that we can and cannot do when it comes to federal law. But we've heard those concerns, and there's specific provisions in this bill that deal with that.
Thank you.
Well, I'll just add, then maybe Michelle, you can step in on this. But first of all, you see in the other states, you've got California, San Diego, Naval Base, you've got South Dakota, ICBM. So there are a lot of federal contractors, defense contractors around the country where they have had legalized marijuana. As Mike said, those federal laws still hold, and there is, testing and otherwise that show that you on the employment line in an Electric Boat cannot use marijuana. That's what the federal rules are there. And those rules are being applied around the rest of the country and enforced appropriately. Michelle, anything else?
No, I think both you and Representative D'Agostino explained it right. Their employment, of course, is a challenge with this, but the bill addresses it in a pretty detailed way.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Steve. Moving on to the Associated Press.
Thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. This is Sue Haig from AP. I've heard from concerns raised by Senator McCrory and lawmakers about how the medical marijuana growers may have a head start in this new market, and that would put the little guys sort of behind the 8-ball as the system gets up to speed. And there's also been concerns about how these little guys might be able to get capital that they need. I'm not sure if the bill addresses that as well. But could you speak to both of those concerns, please?
Roden, do you want to try that?
Sure. Yeah. We had within the equity task force kind of puzzled a couple ways of doing this. The problem we have is that in order to fund any sort of an equity program, you need revenue. And so this creates a system in which medical marijuana producers get up and running, and that revenue can then be used for some sort of for aid to cities and towns, for equity, and also this task force, the initial equity commission that's created by this bill can put certain requirements on the medical marijuana producers. We talked about potentially requirements for some sort of small incubator programs within the medical marijuana producers that would give future cannabis owners of color some training opportunities, because it's a very difficult kind of technical field. both the business side and the technical side of growing these plants are complicated, and getting folks into these businesses might give them the training to succeed in the long run. We've talked about community impact for these medical marijuana producers, and the Equity Commission would be able to create a plan for the marijuana producers who get up and running, and be able to certify them before they are able to start selling into a recreational market. And then in the long run, it creates a structure for funding an equity program that has impacts both in the community and that sets up businesses owned by people of color for success by giving them creating opportunities for training and jobs programs. But it builds all of those around data. We've already started working with CCSU on an equity analysis to identify the most disproportionately impacted regions and neighborhoods in the state at as surgical a level as possible, so that we can develop plans to through recreational cannabis impact those neighborhoods that have been historically impacted by the war on drugs, that have been historically so much more disproportionately impacted by a variety of social factors. But all of that requires some level of revenue, and so for the reasons that Ken talked about, the Massachusetts programs, there are a number of programs across the country that focus on giving equity applicants a head start through the door. What we find is that 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, not a lot of these applicants are up and running. Oftentimes, they're not employing a lot of folks in the community. It doesn't create a sustainable program that has an impact in the long run. And what this bill sought to do, what the community leaders who contributed to this bill, and Senator McCrory was part of those discussions as well, what they sought to do was have a plan that's sustainable and that continues to impact those communities 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, that over time really redresses equity and doesn't just give a few owners a leg up in the short term.
I get what you're saying, but it seems like that would take a really long time. And then in the meantime, you're going to have a system up and running where these big guys that are already in the business with the medical marijuana would have a head start and maybe, a bigger control of the market. Or am I just misreading that?
No, I understand that criticism, and I get it. And honestly, coming into this discussion before, I had these conversations with regulators in other states and with community leaders in our own state. I would have tended to agree with those criticisms. I think that, look, as you zoom out, it does take a long time. It took a long time to destroy communities of colors in the state and in this country. It took a long time for the effects of cannabis to continue to disadvantage generations of Black and brown people in the state. And it takes a long time to unwind. And I think that looking for a day one solution ignores the reality that we need a solution that is going to continue to impact communities of color across the state. Look, I live in a region in a part of Hartford, in the south end of Hartford, that has seen the impact of the war on drugs, that's seen the impact of the collateral consequences of folks with criminal records. I see it in my neighbors. I see it on my street every day. And for me, this is a really personal thing. I want to feel like in 20 years from now, we have done the best we can to impact the communities that have been hurt for so long, instead of scoring the quick political victory and having a few businesses open as equity applicants on day one. This is about creating generations of change, and I think that takes a while.
And thanks for that. And just a quick question, and I apologize for not knowing this, but does the bill address the banking challenges? I know that's always been a problem, seeing as how the feds still see this as an illegal product.
I can help answer that. It requires sort of a study and review of that with the banking commissioner. It's very hard for Connecticut unilaterally to solve the banking problem. Just banks are FDIC insured, and that's a federal thing. There's a lot happening at the federal level and a change in administration. So some of that may ease through just changes federally. But it's a challenge certainly every state is facing, and as every state moves more and more towards adult use cannabis, it's one that's certainly on everybody's radar screen.
Okay, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
All right, thank you, Sue. Moving along, I know folks got to jump at 11, but we'll try to get through all the media outlets. We've got WTNH. All right, WFSB.
Good morning. I apologize because I did get into the Zoom a little bit late, but my question is, many people in Connecticut are very proud of the way that the medicinal or the medical marijuana program has been run. Has limited growers, producers, a lot of checks and balances and regulations. How will that carry over for recreational marijuana? Is that something that's important, and could that change at some point, and will that be an issue for some?
I can take that unless you'd like to, Governor. Well, first, thank you. We have worked hard on the medical program to make it one Connecticut can be proud of. And, you know, certainly where Connecticut was in 2012, there was a lot more concern about kind of any legalization of cannabis, even medical. So one of the ways some of the social equity concerns are, however, exacerbated because of the tight regulations. It is a high cost to entry and there are limited players. So some of that, I think necessarily and appropriately will change, but we are taking a lot of what we've learned so that the adult use cannabis can still be something Connecticut's proud of. We're going to do a lot to ensure product safety. The products will continue to be laboratory tested, just like the medical products are. We're going to require security plans. We're going to have a seed to sale tracking system to protect against diversion. So that's another important component. There's a lot in this bill to protect against use by underage, whether it's child resistant packaging, just like we have in the medical program, restrictions on advertising. You can't target it to an audience that is not of age. So there's going to be a lot of that. You can't have, big signs that are seen by a right of way that would impact. And then there's a lot in here to protect the medical community. What we don't want, there's almost 50,000 patients. We don't want them to suddenly be left behind in this. And so any medical business that wants to start selling to adult users would need to have a conversion plan that's acceptable to the department that shows how they're going to make sure their patients are still going to get access to the medicine they need.
And I think my second, thank you, is really for the governor. There are those who feel that just because other states are doing this doesn't mean that Connecticut should, and that there are downsides to this, drug abuse. And so how do you address that, Governor? How do you address what people are saying, that just because other states are doing it doesn't mean Connecticut should? And is the money really worth it?
Well, first of all, you heard, you can drive to Massachusetts. Pretty soon you'll be able to drive to New York. You can drive to New Jersey. You can drive back and forth. You think that's a safer, better way to do it? Or you buy from the guy on the street corner, which is sort of the way it's been historically done. You think that's a safer, more public health conscious way to do it? I don't think so. I'm not doing it just because everybody else is doing it, but I think there's a certain practicality to this. And so to your other question about, the medical marijuana dispensaries, you're right. They've done it in a very thoughtful way. They've done it in a way that's closely regulated, done it with an emphasis upon health. They made sure that it goes to the appropriate people without diversion. So that's another of the reasons that they will be the first out of the box, making sure that they and others work with the broader community, especially those in the Black and brown community, and make sure they get their shot at this.
Thank you. And just to follow up with the DCP commissioner, so we're not going to see big signs along I-91 saying, for a good buzz, take exit 32, because that's what we're seeing from Massachusetts.
Yeah, I have to look a little more closely. License, the restrictions are on the businesses and our ability to regulate them. What I don't know is how much you have in Massachusetts are one, we can't regulate what those businesses are putting up in Connecticut to attract people. But so the restrictions here would apply just to the Connecticut businesses that we're licensing. That's sort of the universe we can control. So that's why you'll continue certainly to see some signs, unfortunately, but this would prevent people who are making money in Connecticut getting licenses from us from doing that, the kind of advertising that target or that's seen by people who are in it sets it at if more than 10% are under the age of 21, that's not going to be acceptable.
And Michelle, let me talk to Governor Charlie Baker about that, because that makes no sense that he can advertise in Connecticut and our guys can't. I don't think either should be doing billboard advertising. I think it's the wrong way to go, and I'll make that case.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sue. Moving on to NBC Connecticut. All right, Fox 61. The Connecticut Mirror.
Morning, everybody. Is the technology for automatic erasure related to the technology planned on for last year's clean slate bill?
Who does that? Michelle, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I probably would defer to Mike Waller a little bit. All I can tell you is, yeah, the issue here is indeed the technology. You put your finger on it. In a nutshell, we can automatically erase the convictions prior to 2015. When we made the change for the infraction law in 2015, though, what ended up happening is that those various convictions for those misdemeanors were all lumped in together. So you can't disaggregate and know when a conviction was for cannabis versus another controlled substance. So we can't do an automatic. We do not have the technology to do right now to do an automatic expungement post 2015. And that's why the bill requires a petitioning process so we can, understand what the person was convicted for. We're hoping to solve that. We're looking at solutions for that, but that's why the bill is structured the way it is with that 2015 dividing line. There's a technological issue there.
Got it. Thank you. And is the Equity Committee going to exist forever and be issuing recommendations in perpetuity, or will they eventually disband?
The way it's set up is an initial equity commission will be developed to make some initial recommendations. One of those recommendations would be what should a permanent equity group look like. So it may end up existing in a different form based on that recommendation. And Arunan, you may have more contribute to that.
Yeah, but based on the language, the initial equity commission would not disband until a new permanent equity commission is set up by legislation.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kel. Moving on to the Connecticut News Junkie.
Thanks, Rob. Governor, this is one of those issues that seems to pull pretty well with the general public, at least it has for the past few years. The legislature is a different animal, I guess. Can you describe what your administration is doing to sort of get lawmakers on board with this proposal and how you think that process is going so far this year?
Thank you. That's a good point. If you look around the country, the voters have been ahead of legislators. I think the vast majority of those states that have legalized recreational marijuana did it by referendum. Mike D'Agostino knows that a small but loud group can have a disparate impact upon the legislature. But I think I hope this time is different. I think they see that we're doing this in a very thoughtful way with an emphasis upon public health, an emphasis upon making sure that we restrict who this is marketed and advertised to in a way that's better than surrendering it to the underground market or surrendering it to out-of-state markets.
Would you say your administration is actively lobbying this, though, with lawmakers?
Well, I think it's the right time to do it. I'm putting my shoulder to the wheel, but I hope my team is doing that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Hugh. Moving on to the Waterbury Republican American. All right, Hartford Business Journal. And last but not least, anyone from public radio on.
Hello, Governor. This is Matt Dwyer. I understand that some fellow Democrats have said that they think your proposal does not go far enough in terms of racial equity issues. Are you open to some possible changes or adjustments in that area?
Yeah, I mean, this is, we're putting forward our bill with our best idea how we can do this in a safe, regulated way that addresses, racial equity issues. Roden says we've got a commission out there that's going to be addressing these things. So this is the beginning of a discussion, not the end of a discussion.
All right, and very, very quickly, I see the hand of the Connecticut Examiner raised. We got time for one more question.
Great. Hi, thank you. I have a question about the equity discussion group that Arunan mentioned. To what degree is that group involved in the crafting of the bill, and were the recommendations from that group involved, like adopted in the legislation?
Yeah, I can speak to that. We took input from group members. There were, because of the sort of timetable and we spent a fair amount of time listening to regulators from other states and discussing ideas. We never got to finalize and vote on recommendations as a group, but the structure that the group discussed, the idea of starting with an equity analysis, which I think is really key, to focus on what equity means. And I think that's a struggle that a lot of other states have had. If you can't put a racial definition of equity into the language of a bill, and I think at the same time, we all agree that Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately impacted and bear a specific burden and need to be a part of the solution going forward. And so creating a definition around equity was an idea that those discussions and the equity analysis that the governor's office has already engaged CCSU on is a part of that. Having sort of multiple buckets looking at both the licenses, but also the requirements we're going to put on non-equity applicants going down the road, and the revenue piece of it, having a structure that is broad-based, certainly came out of that group. I think that the structure we came from was heavily informed by the group.
Thank you. And sorry, just one more thing really quickly. I know that the bill calls for an equity commission that would do a study and then make more specific recommendations about what those equity applicants look like and where revenue is targeted that you mentioned, but that the legalization implementation would still move forward before those results were necessarily out or voted on in the legislature. And I'm curious about that timeline. Why start with this process before necessarily having the results of the equity study?
Can I jump in on that in part response?
Sure.
Okay. I think that there's nothing wrong, and Elizabeth, of having them move parallel in similar tracks. And as it moves forward, you continue to identify stakeholders and interested parties to make the program and the legislation even better that's been introduced to ensure that it's as comprehensive as possible to address all issues related to equity or those that might arise.
Yeah, I agree entirely, Reverend Jackson. And again, I think that starting this equity conversation is impossible until we have a definition of equity that can work in a practical way. And also the equity conversation, I think most stakeholders agree, needs to focus on both the licensing and the revenue. And so in some ways, if we halt everything to focus on licensing, communities are losing out of revenue that can be impacting them right now, and revenue that's going to Massachusetts and eventually going to New York, going to Rhode Island. And so taking a look at this, do we want to put a hold on licensing so we can give a few licensees short-term advantage that we have seen from other states does not end up playing out in the long run, doesn't end up with a very diverse market, doesn't end up with the kind of equity we really want for the political win now? Or do we want to create a plan that allows both applicants to succeed in the long run and revenue to come into these communities In the shorter term, that can have a real impact right now. And I think the more equitable thing to do is to look at that broad-based solution to equity instead of just favoring a few social equity applicants.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you to all today's panelists. Any questions from the media, certainly let us know offline. And that concludes our press conference for the afternoon.
Good work, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Governor.
Stay well.